many men struggle with emotional vulnerability in relationships. Based on your experience working with thousands of couples at this point, what are some effective ways men can develop greater emotional intelligence while still honoring their masculine essence?
So I'm going to give you two ways. The first is the mindset, the second is a tool. The mindset around vulnerability that changed everything for me. I learned from one of my colleagues, Annie Lalla. She defined vulnerability as just emotional honesty. It's being honest about your feelings. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It isn't anything other than actually just being honest about what you're feeling. And most of us are dishonest. People say, "How are you feeling?" I'm like, "I'm good." No, you're not good. We can tell on your face you're not good. That's dishonest. That's not vulnerable. When you say, feeling a bit sad, that's vulnerable. So the tool I want to introduce you to that helped me be vulnerable is this idea, and I teach this in all of my courses. It's an idea called hard and soft emotion. And the idea is very simple, that there are two fundamental categories of emotions that we can express in relationship with another. And hard emotions tend to drive our partner away. They're not vulnerable. Soft emotions tend to pull our partner towards us, closer to us, and they are vulnerable. Hard emotions are all some flavor or version of anger. So frustrated, annoyed, disappointed, upset. And they have an implied at you, Buster. I'm annoyed. What am I not saying? At you. I'm frustrated. What am I not saying? At you. I'm disappointed with you. And so they all land, when you share those emotions with your partner, they land as an attack, as a punch. And your partner's immediately going to go into defense mode. And then you start the cycle of conflict again. And they're also only really like 10% of what you're feeling. If you think of an iceberg, you can only see 10% of the iceberg above the water. Well, your hard emotions are that 10% of your emotional iceberg. The 90% that you're not showing your partner are the soft emotions. And often we present hard emotions to deflect our partner's attention away from our soft emotions because we're afraid that if we're vulnerable, bad things will happen. We'll get hurt, we'll get attacked, we'll get taken advantage of. So we're like, I'm fine. I'm annoyed. I'm upset. And then we drive our partner away. On the other hand, you've got soft emotions that don't have the implied at you or by you or with you afterwards. And what distinguishes them is they're all one word. So sad, lonely, ashamed, embarrassed, disappointed could be either a hard or a soft emotion, depending on whether or not it's I'm disappointed or feeling disappointed in myself. And I'm pointing a finger back here. Lonely, you know, anything that is self-reflective and points the finger back at you, and where you can't say there's an implied at you, that's a soft emotion. And that's how you start the process of learning how to be vulnerable. There's many more steps that will increase your emotional intelligence. In module 6 of my popular course called The Conflict Cure, we do a whole section on emotional intelligence, because I think you're right. Us men in particular really need to learn how to increase our emotional intelligence so that we can dance with our partner and meet them where they're at. And it's such a joy when you can, it's like having color, on your painting. Before emotional intelligence, we're painting in black and white. Once we become emotionally intelligent, life becomes colorful and full of, I mean, it's just full of contrast, and it makes it so much more interesting and dynamic. So that's what I got for you.
Yeah. Bruce, thank you. I think that's so helpful. And for any guy listening, you need to hear that again on a new definition of vulnerability, that it's not weakness, as many of us interpret, but it's simply being emotionally honest with yourself. Three stages that a relationship goes through. You've outlined a fascinating developmental model that helps couples understand where they are in the journey and what challenges they may face at each stage. Could you walk us through these stages and how couples can recognize where they're at in the process?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most useful ideas I learned along the way as I was studying relationships for my own benefit, because I kind of got into this because I had an epiphany one day where I realized that the common denominator in my failed relationships was moi. And I couldn't ignore that I needed to do the work on myself. And as I was studying relationships, one of the things that made me feel very normal was understanding that there are developmental stages that relationships pass through. And just like we grow up from being, an infant to a toddler to a teenager to a 20 something, and hopefully we make it to wise old man or wise old woman, our relationship also grows up in stages. And just like the personal stages we go through, you cannot skip them. So you can't go from toddler to wise old man or wise old woman. You got to go through all the other stages first. And there's no guarantee you'll get to wise old man or wise old woman. And in the same way, our relationship is to go through stages. And so the first one we call the romance stage or the honeymoon stage. We all know this one. It's the most immature form of love. And the two of you come together, you're bonded together, and you're literally high on love drugs. Your brain is pumping out oxytocin and serotonin and vasopressin, all these beautiful chemicals that have you hooked on each other. And you really can only see each other through these kind of rose tinted glasses. And you don't really see each other's shadow side. All you see is their good side. That's all you present, and you fall in love. And it's nature's way of bonding us together. It's very appropriate, and it's a wonderful time. And I think where we get stuck is we believe that that's what love is, or that's what love should look like. And so it keeps us yearning for the romance stage, but the romance stage only lasts for about 6 months to 2 years maximum. And then it's gone forever, and it's never, ever, 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 ever coming back. So I think a lot of men, I mean, and women too, get stuck in this ideal of like what love should look like. And Hollywood doesn't help because it also promotes this image of what, a soulmate relationship should look like. But what they're really talking about is the romance stage, which is by definition the most immature form of love. In fact, I don't even think it's love. It's drug-induced infatuation. And so if we're seeking that, whenever our relationship naturally progresses to the next stage, we're going to think something's wrong. And so around about the 6 month mark to the 2 year mark, those love drugs start, kind of wearing off. And it happens when we perceive some kind of permanence to the relationship. So it could be you move in together, or you get married, or you commit to being monogamous. I don't know, it's different for everybody. But some kind of permanence happens, and suddenly you wake up to the reality that this person you were infatuated with, in fact, has a bad side too. They have a shadow side, a dark side too, believe it or not. Those rose tinted glasses, they get knocked off your face, and all you can see now is what you don't like about them, all the annoying things about them. And where once perhaps, their emotional vulnerability and openness used to appeal to you, now all you can see is that she's a drama queen. She's emotional all the time, and you can't stand it. And one day you wake up and think, geez, what have I done? Do I really want to spend the rest of my life with this person? But that's the natural progression. That's like your relationship's teenage years. And we call this second stage the power struggle stage. And it's a completely appropriate stage for you to go through, because if the romance stage kind of bonded you together with love drugs, then you can't stay in that dependent state forever. You've got to individuate. And so the next developmental stage is the power struggle stage, and it's meant to help you separate from each other in a healthy way, not so far that you lose each other, but so that you are able to maintain your sense of self, your autonomy. Because in the romance stage, we kind of lose ourselves. We bond together and we become this couple that forms, and that's great. As you bond, it's good to create this third entity called the couple. So the way I talk about relationships is if you've got one partner, another partner, and then the couple. There's three entities going on here. And so the romance stage gives birth to the couple, kind of like partners give birth to a baby. And it's your job then in the power struggle stage to learn how to nurture this couple, to learn how to meet each other's needs and meet your own needs at the same time. And I think a lot of couples struggle here because either they drift apart and lose each other, or they try and stay enmeshed in the romance stage and they lose themselves. Either way, it causes conflict in the relationship. And that's what the power struggle stage is characterized by, is conflict. And it's normal and it's natural. And when I discovered this, I was like, I sighed such a big sigh of relief, because I began thinking, okay, so I'm normal for experiencing conflict in relationships. And I think the way through this is to learn how to manage conflict in a way that keeps you safely connected, resolves the issues together, and actually helps each of you understand each other more. And if you're insecurely attached, which we can talk about in a moment, that can often be difficult. And so this is where most couples end up fighting, and this is where divorces happen, this is where breakups happen. And so if you've ever kind of struggled in your relationships, I want you to know that you're normal, and what's probably going on is your relationship has entered the power struggle stage. But if we believe that love should look like the romance stage, we're going to start looking elsewhere and go, well, maybe this relationship isn't working. I should probably go and find somebody I'm more suited to. And that is a myth. I mean, I'm not saying that all relationships are meant to last forever. This power struggle stage is going to test your relationship, but it'll also test you. And the way through it is to actually look at it as a growth opportunity. And if you're lucky enough to make it through your power struggle stage without it destroying your relationship, then you enter what I call the mature love stage. And in the mature love stage, you've actually learned how to resolve conflict. You've resolved so much of your conflict. You can be together as a couple, dependent on each other in a healthy way. And I love to talk about healthy dependence versus unhealthy dependence, because I think in our culture, we perceive that all dependence is unhealthy. So there's a healthy way to be dependent on each other. And you can be independent of each other in a healthy way. So you're not abandoning each other by being independent. You have your own lives. Each of you have two individual lives with your own friends, and you have your joint life, the life of the couple that has its own circle of friends, its own interests. And that way you maintain your autonomy and you maintain your connection. And couples in the mature love stage are actually characterized by often they get involved in some kind of joint project that emerges out of the relationship, out of their union. And you can really tell, like one of the classic ones I think of is Michelle and Barack Obama. They are a couple in the mature love stage. They've used their relationship to make the world a better place, and they continue to do so. And it's kind of was given birth to out of their partnership. There's many more couples like this. It doesn't have to be a project that improves the world, but it's some kind of project that I think in the mature love stage, you realize that my needs are met. I don't need to focus on me anymore. And you naturally begin to shift your focus from you and I to the world. Like, how can we give back? You and I are cool. We're good. We've got each other's backs. We're fine. We're not, hyper focused on meeting each other's needs anymore. They just kind of get met. Now, what are we going to do with our life? And it's kind of a natural progression to begin looking outward into the world and to start giving back. So those are the three stages of relationship I teach. Most of the couples I work with at Love at First Fight are couples stuck in the power struggle stage. They're stuck with conflict and they're battling to resolve issues. They have recurring fights. One of them withdraws, the other one tends to chase, and they end up just unhappy or broken up. So those are the three stages.
So clearly and concisely. The last part you mentioned about that final stage reminds me of an author I appreciate, Richard Rohr, who talks about the two halves of life and how many times that midlife crisis is that journey or transition from life being about me to life being about we, and seeing yourself as greater than yourself and what you can offer, not trying to prove yourself, not trying to be right, not trying to create enemies. So I think that's helpful that you mentioned that. I have two questions within that. So the first would be, do you have a sense of why nature and biology has a reason for the first stage? I mean, I understand there's a need to bond and connect, but I would agree that it's not the truest form of love. So just your personal take on why that first stage may be important, considering it seems to have some potentially negative risk on the back end. And then the second question would be, how do people move healthily? What are some questions to ask, some things to look out for from that first to second stage?
This is my perspective only. I'm not saying this is the truth. The way that makes the viewpoint that makes the most sense to me is from the standpoint of survival, that our brains have evolved over millions of years to survive. How do we survive? By reproducing. So nature needs to make sure that we reproduce. So when we find someone that reminds us of what love looks like when we were children, our experience of love as a child, we will be drawn to them. And nature provides the drugs to make sure we bond, reproduce, and then that we stay together to raise the child. And so nature needs us to bond strongly, which is why the romance stage exists, so that we've got good memories of how good we can be, so that when the going gets tough and we're raising children and, we're fighting for our lives out there, caveman and cavewoman on the plains of Africa, that, caveman doesn't abandon cave mom, because if cave dad abandons cave mom, cave baby dies and the human race goes extinct. So we need to actually have a unit of mom and dad to raise a child. And because human beings have the largest brains of all creatures, what ends up happening is it takes 15 years before the average human is capable of surviving on their own. So mom and dad, and the brain is fully formed. And so mom and dad need to stay together for 15 years, ideally, in order to raise secure, healthy children that can fend for themselves and continue the human race. And so I look through relationship challenges through the lens of survival. Because when human beings do dumb shit, basically, like we lose our mind in relationship and we say things that we regret and we fight and we throw things and we yell or whatever it is, it's usually not us doing that. It's our amygdala, the part of our reptilian brain that's responsible for survival, the fight or flight mechanism. And so it explains why people say and do sometimes nasty things that they're ashamed of later on during conflict, because they perceive a threat to their life when their partner isn't available for them or isn't responsive to them or isn't displaying the sense that they have their back. And as far as our amygdala is concerned, if your partner is going to leave you or abandon you or isn't there for you, you're going to die. If you're on the plains of Africa and caveman or cave dad abandons cave mom dies and cave baby dies. Mom can't hunt for food without leaving cave baby behind. But if she takes cave baby with her, then cave baby cries, chases away animals, and mom dies of starvation. If she leaves cave baby behind, cave baby gets eaten while she's out hunting. Either way, the human race goes extinct. So to me, that makes the most sense. It's not a romantic notion of love, but it's the one that the research shows seems to be the most inclusive, that love is a survival bond and nature needs us to survive in order to reproduce. Now, you can add any other layer of meaning on top of that. There's spiritual meanings, there's, you know, the romantic meanings, but that's how I see it. So your second question was, how do you move through the power struggle stage? And there are a couple of key skills you need to learn. The most important one is you need to learn how to resolve conflict and repair hurt. You can do those two things, you'll get through to the other side a lot quicker. It doesn't mean that conflict's bad or that conflict won't happen again, because conflict's going to be with us for the rest of our lives. In fact, I seem to remember reading somewhere that the number one predictor of divorce was the absence of conflict. And that's because couples who don't argue through and work through their conflict just sweep it under the rug. And then it builds up like a pressure cooker until it explodes the relationship and destroys things. So you want to have conflict in your relationship. You just want to have a way of working through it that bonds you together and resolves it rather than rips out the fabric of your relationship from beneath you. And that's what I teach couples to do.
I know that neuroscientists call it the amygdala hijack. Well, more or less, the amygdala takes over that prefrontal cortex that makes the rational decisions. And your perspective there is not only, I think, backed by strong evidence and years of us repeating these patterns, but it provides a compassionate approach, because I think there can often be this shame, like, well, why did I get so upset? Or why am I not connecting with this person?
Well,
Or
what's
why am I
wrong with me?
freaking out?
Yeah.
Exactly. What's wrong with me over something that's such a small ordeal? And what you're getting at is, hey, when you peek beneath the hood, there's a lot more going on. I would venture to say 80-90% that is driving those actions, that if you're able to tie to it, it changes your awareness and what you name in the moment. Instead of saying, what's your fault or it's my fault, there's something wrong with me. It's saying, all right, let's take a step back. I feel like I might be abandoned in this moment. Hey, I feel really insecure because when you said that, it makes me feel disconnected, like you may leave. And every time, it maybe not this extreme, you're going to leave, but maybe in that micro moment, you certainly feel that that disconnect is a small reflection of the ultimate permanent leaving that someone can do.
And I think that it's not a thought when you get triggered that your partner's going to leave necessarily. I mean, it could be for some people, but your amygdala perceives if you go, I'm dead at some level because it uses such simple logic. Like we need to fight to stay alive or flee to stay alive. And one thing I'd say to my clients is never believe the words your partner says when they're triggered because their prefrontal cortex is starved of oxygen. Because when we're triggered, our brain has to redirect blood flow to our arms and our legs to punch or to run in order to fight or flee. So when we get triggered, we immediately, our IQ drops massively. And this is why we say dumb stuff when we're triggered, because our prefrontal cortex, the logical thinking part of our brain, is really kind of half offline.
Yeah, exactly. We're not operating with all systems go there. And we need to acknowledge that. Yeah, no, and I appreciate you mentioning the conflict as an invitation to intimacy. And I know we'll get into attachment styles later. I think it's also important to name the different perspectives of conflict. I grew up in the culture in the American South where it's very conflict avoidant. I never saw my parents fight. I couldn't confront my parents or my family if an issue without them being sensitive or defensive. So that was the model for me. I internalized that. Then I bring it into my relationship. And I think, well, if there's conflict, there's something wrong. And this was most reflective. I'm curious your thoughts here in my now marriage when I was dating my wife who's from the Northeast. She's a Boston gal. She's very much like, let's put the gloves on and let's go to work, for 5 minutes and it's gonna be a massive explosion, but then I'm gonna settle down and everything's gonna be okay. And I remember when we were dating, there was that dynamic at play where I was avoidant, I was overly sensitive and trying to not face the conflict. I saw it as something wrong. And she kept moving towards me, almost in this not aggression, but a very strong assertiveness to try to resolve it. And in our individual reflection of the relationship, I would say, man, we had a lot of issues at first, right? We fought a lot. We really did not understand each other and those things. And she was like, I thought it was normal. I thought like it was actually a good sign because we were able to disagree, understand each other, move through it. And, this is the person that I love and that eventually becomes the person I know the most. And yet to have such different perspectives is just very interesting. Curious if you have any thoughts on if you find that that conflict perspective plays into this whole thing.
I think so. I mean, I don't have any particular thoughts on your situation. It sounds very common. Usually, there's one partner in a relationship who is very anxious to resolve things quickly, and there's another partner who is slightly afraid of what might happen if they're thrust into their feelings too soon, because they tend to not want to feel their feelings, and conflict is something that at some level they're afraid of. And so these two often fall in love and end up driving each other crazy until they figure out their way or not of resolving things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Glad to hear it's certainly common.
The most common pattern out of all the patterns, that's the most common pattern. Yeah.
Well, and what's not common is this individual idea that you have of connect first, communicate later. It seems counterintuitive to many couples who believe communication is the foundation for everything. We often hear this and a lot of self help. It's all about communication. And could you speak to this approach and share some of the practical tools that you've developed to help couples implement this in their relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So, something you may not be aware of is that couples therapy has the highest failure rate of any therapy. And I think it's because couples therapists often work with couples and they haven't been qualified to work with couples. In the US, you can be an individual therapist and work with couples legally without necessarily having specifically trained to work with couples. And so I think what couples therapists often do is try and do individual therapy on each person without treating the relationship, the third entity, and getting the couple connected. And so what ends up happening is that couple therapists will teach the couple communication tools like the I feel communication tool. And this is a very common one. And it sounds something like, honey, when you didn't take the trash out, I felt disappointed. And it's meant to stop the two of you pointing fingers at each other and start pointing a finger back at yourself, owning your words. But when a couple is disconnected, which is most of the time when they're coming in for therapy with a therapist, it sounds like, when you didn't take out the trash, I felt like you were a jerk. And of course, that's just another attack. And now this communication tool has equipped you with better weapons to hurt each other rather than heal each other. And the reason for this, I started realizing as I was studying relationships, was because these couples come in completely disconnected, feeling unsafe. And there's two amygdalas going to war with each other, two fight or flight mechanisms. They don't really want to communicate safely at some level. Their amygdala just wants to stay safe and fight or flee. So I started having this thought, what if I got my couples connected and I didn't teach them any communication tools to start with? I just spent the first couple of weeks increasing their connection battery charge. So if they walk in at a 10% charge, let's get it up to 80% before we even get them talking to each other. And so that's what I started doing. And their results skyrocketed because when I started to teach them communication tools while they were already connected, they felt safe. They felt bonded. They naturally started communicating in a way that signaled to their spouse that everything's okay here. I got your back. We're safe. We're just talking about a difficult issue, but fundamentally, we're okay. So I labeled this idea connect first, communicate later. And it's become the foundation of everything I teach with couples. And I think it's the primary reason for my success rate with couples is that once you're connected, you naturally communicate kindly. And when you're communicating kindly, you naturally want to collaborate together. And when you're collaborating, you can actually resolve things as a team, get back on the same page, and work through things without blowing up the relationship in the middle of the conversation. Because at some level, your amygdala, your reptilian brain, feels safe, goes, okay, we're good. We're holding hands. She's stroking my leg. She's smiling. Her body language is open. Everything's good because you're connected first. And so I think this is an idea that's only now starting to get into the mainstream. And if you're a couples therapist watching this video, I implore you to try this out. So you can get your couples connected first in the first couple of weeks. Don't get them talking about their problems because they're just going to do the same thing they always did. And they're not going to stay in the communication tools. They're not going to be able to continue to use those structures that you teach them. And so when couples get connected first, things flow so much more smoothly. And suddenly they can walk away in a couple of sessions with massive progress. They don't need, 6 months of therapy in order to make a difference in their relationship or marriage.
Yeah, Bruce, that's brilliant. The ironic thing is, I'm an individual therapist who works with couples who happens to struggle with this very thing. I find that, I have that tendency, and not that I'm biased towards one, but just to try to treat them independently. I will say some work that has been helpful is Dr. John Gottman, who, if you follow his relationship house, is what he calls it. The foundation is the oral relationship history. So he actually has you recount back to, how did you meet? What
Yeah,
was your first date? Those
yeah,
things. And that's a bit of what you're getting at in your own way, which is really reflecting on how are you connected before you were disconnected. So before facing the issues that you're doing nowadays, which I agree with you, it just exacerbates it because you're trying to, I don't know, let's say tear up a foundation that's already cracked, instead of saying, why not build the foundation? And then when we start to deconstruct these issues that we have, it's not that the foundation is going to further crack. In fact, it allows us to clean up so we can rebuild appropriately. So I think that's just brilliant, and I appreciate that framework. I think, yes, many couples need to know that, and I agree. I think that most couples therapy doesn't work, and I have found moments in sessions where I have unintentionally tried to problem solve, which is, unfortunately a primarily male issue of like, well, there's a problem. Let me tell them how to solve it, and then they just start getting into it. They can't solve it. They get more
Yeah.
pissed. The situation gets worse. So, yes, connection first, man. I just really appreciate that.
And there's a time for problem solving, but it's after they're connected and both of them feel heard. Once they feel heard, then they're open. They're like, okay, we're good. We've got each other's backs. Okay, I'm ready to hear the solution now. It's just there's a sequence of events. I think you're right. Many of us men do is like solve problem, pain goes away, we're all good.
Yeah. Instead of trying to
Guilty
understand
as
each other and
charged.
repair. Yeah, exactly. No, as long as we fix it, then it's okay. And I like that relational battery jumping up, from the 10% to the 80 and feeling safe because it's going back to your first point about shifting from that first stage to the second, which is not seeing the conflict as a threat, but a natural dispelling of fantasy that you've had about this person. And to be real about your expectations. Hey, yeah, when I expect you to take out the trash because guess what? That's how I was raised. Okay, good. So good to know that that was a value growing up. And to be real about, you know what? When you don't take out the trash, I think you're lazy. It's like being real about there's a judgment behind it. I think we have so much shame about naming the problems we have with people, we unintentionally over identify them with being who they are. And then you're not just having a conflict as a couple that is behavioral, you're having a conflict as a couple that's identity based. So now you as a couple is a conflict. And now you're having to untether the action from the identity. And like you're saying, get back to the roots of the relationship. I often joke with couples and I say, well, why'd you get married? Why'd you get together? If you thought they were so bad and that you were so good and life was just so amazing when they weren't a pain in your ass, then what in God's green earth made you want to be with them? They obviously have something to offer that you saw. You obviously saw some sort of special connection with them that you feel like you wanted to trust and grow into. How can we tap back into that instead of now seeing each other as this mysterious mistake of being in the relationship with? We mentioned earlier about attachment styles. Your work with it provides a powerful framework for understanding relationship dynamics. Could you explain the different attachment styles for listeners and what each typically struggles with? How couples with different attachment patterns can navigate these differences effectively?
Sure. Well, I think first let's start with looking at what attachment styles are. If you've ever had an experience of thinking your partner just doesn't make sense or scratching your head at why they do what they do, attachment styles are going to explain everything to you. This was probably the biggest aha moment I had when I was learning about relationships way back when in the day. And I'll preface this by saying there are many different attachment models and different researchers, slice and dice attachment styles into different amounts. It started off with kind of John Bowlby and anxious and avoidant and secure. I use a six style model because I find that's the one that most accurately represents the people I work with and that I see every day. And so I've given each attachment style a cute name that's memorable. So these are not therapeutic names. These, I call them the hailstorm, the turtle, the chameleon, the wolf, and the sheep. And then you've got securely attached. So somebody who's securely attached is someone who is used to depending on others and others depending on them. They grew up learning to trust that I can count on my parents to be there emotionally for me and support me and help me through tough times. And as such, they grow up into adults who reach out for others naturally for support and are comfortable having others depend on them. They're not anxious about their relationship. They're pretty confident and secure. And so they tend to not get into trouble. Their power struggle stage, they work through it together and they get through to the mature love stage. And I hardly ever talk to them because they don't come into my office. They don't buy my courses. They don't end up on my website. They're not searching Google for relationship advice. They just kind of figure stuff out on their own generally. But if you're like I think most people in the world, certainly more than 50%, are what we call insecurely attached. And we can take that category of insecurely attached and define it as people who are not comfortable depending on others in relationship, who are not comfortable having others depend on them in relationship, who don't feel secure about the state of their relationships naturally, and who tend to struggle or feel a little bit anxious, or they tend to shut down. And so I'm going to divide this category into 5 types called the hailstorm, the turtle, the chameleon, the wolf, and the sheep. So the hailstorm is somebody who is afraid of abandonment at some level. They often grew up in a childhood environment where there was inconsistent support. Maybe mom worked and wasn't always available for the child. And the child knew how good it felt to be comforted emotionally by mom when the child was in distress, but then also learned how scary it was when mom wasn't there. And they never really knew whether or not mom was going to be there or not be there. And so this made them hypervigilant, constantly tracking mom's behavior and mom's location to see, is mom going to be here for me? Am I safe? Can I relax? And so these children grow up into adults who are a little bit anxious in relationships. They're anxious about their partner's availability, about whether or not they're going to be abandoned. They tend to get worked up during conflict when they feel unsafe. And they sometimes can get needy and chase their partner or pursue their partner. So this is called the hailstorm. And hailstorms tend to fall in love with turtles. So turtles, on the other hand, are kind of the opposite of hailstorms. They tend to shut down emotionally when they're in distress. It's kind of like they have this pair of scissors and they sever the connection from their head to their heart, so they don't feel any pain. And they learned to do this because as children, they probably had kind of their physical needs met, but their parents never demonstrated for them what it was like to rely on somebody else to meet your emotional needs. So when they were in distress, their parents kind of left them alone, like big boys don't cry. Or in a family like you described earlier on in your family, you were talking about in the South, you never really grew up talking about emotions or processing emotions together as a family. And so nobody was there to support this young child emotionally when the child was going through emotional distress. And without having anybody to help them, the pain just was too much to bear. It was overwhelming. And so the nervous system just literally goes, we're going to sever the connection to the heart in order to survive this difficult pain. And so they go numb during conflict. They numb themselves and they retreat into their shell like a turtle does. They kind of don't want to pop their head out until they feel safe. They need lots of alone time when they're triggered, and they want space. And so what happens with many hailstorm turtle couples is the more the hailstorm pursues, the more the turtle retreats into their shell and wants more space, which of course terrifies the hailstorm and triggers the hailstorm's fear of abandonment. The hailstorm pursues even more, hailstorming down on the turtle. The turtle retreats even more, and round this couple go until both partners are far apart. And eventually, the hailstorm retreats too, because everything they've done to reach their turtle partner has failed. And now they kind of just give up. And if you then you've got no people, I mean, you've got 2 people who have retreated, and so nobody's on the dance floor, kind of dancing through the relationship of life together. Dancing, I love to use dancing as a metaphor for what it is to be in a partnership. And now both people have left the dance floor. So that's the hailstorm and the turtle. It's the most common pattern, and those are the 2 most common types. However, there are 3 other types that are slightly less common and are characterized by a little bit of, or a lot of, trauma. So the third type is the chameleon. Now, the chameleon grew up in a family environment where they either had a critical parent, like a parent who was often negative or giving negative feedback to the child, or they had an overbearing or overprotective parent. And the child learns that I need to put a smile on mom or dad's face, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble because mom looks unhappy with me. And if mom abandons me, I am going to die. Caveman, cave woman, cave child in the fields of Africa. If cave mom and dad abandon me, cave child dies. So I'm going to do whatever I can. This is kind of like, the amygdala's survival strategy to make sure mom and dad stay together so they can look after me. I'm going to make it my mission to put a smile on mom and dad's face, and they become pleasing. The chameleons tend to be people pleasers. They are conflict avoidant. They do not want to go anywhere near conflict. because they're afraid that it will end badly and end up with separation. And so at a very young age, usually, they learn to please their parents, sacrifice their own needs for the needs of their parents. And they grow up into adults who, in romantic relationships, over focus on pleasing their partner and meeting their partner's needs first, even at the cost of having their own needs met. But of course, this eventually leads to resentment. And very often, the chameleon ends up plotting their escape at some point and leaves once they're convinced that they'll never get their needs met in this relationship. But what the chameleon often doesn't see is their compulsive people pleasing and lack of boundary setting and kind of lack of understanding of their own needs and willingness to risk asking to have their needs met ends up in resentment, and they end up sabotaging every relationship they're in. At some point, they feel like they've lost themselves. But here's the thing, they've never expressed to their partner how to get their needs met. They've never asked for their needs to be met because they're too afraid that would result in conflict. And so they over focus on meeting their partner's needs. So obviously the chameleon's needs go unmet for so long that the chameleon's starved of having their needs met, and they eventually leave, often to the great surprise of their partner who thought everything was okay because the chameleon was always smiley and happy. Chameleons are wonderful people to be with because they're so focused on you. They make you feel really good about yourself, and they go out of their way to meet your needs until they don't. And so chameleons struggle in relationships. They often have low self-esteem, particularly if they had a critical parent. They internalize their parents' kind of voice, and their own internal dialogue is often that, I'm defective in some way. So they tend to not want to open up and be vulnerable just in case their partner does realize that they are defective and then abandons them and leaves them. Chameleons also want closeness. They're very relational people. But unlike the hailstorm, who kind of engages in conflict, the chameleon avoids conflict at all costs. And unlike the turtle, the chameleon is feeling a lot of emotion, whereas the turtle is very shut down because they sever the connection to their heart when they're triggered. Now, of course, all of these are a continuum. It's not black and white. You're going to be somewhere on the continuum of being a hailstorm. You could be extremely hailstormy or extremely turtly or somewhere in the middle. So those are the most common three I see. Then you have the wolf and the sheep. And what characterizes the wolf and the sheep is that both wolves and sheep have experienced what I call capital T trauma, whereas the chameleon might have some kind of lowercase t trauma. They went through a tough time. They had parents who neglected them, perhaps. They weren't necessarily sexually abused or, completely abandoned by their parents and left to fend for themselves. Whereas wolves and sheep were. They experienced some kind of trauma, often at the hands of their parents, or if not at the hands of their parents, at the hands of somebody else, and their parents didn't support them sufficiently. And so they learned that my parents aren't there for me. I can't count on my parents. My parents are actually dangerous. And so this put the wolf and the sheep in a very difficult position. They want to bond with their parents because they love their parents. They're compelled to move towards the person that they're afraid of. But they also feel like I need to defend myself from my parent because my parent's going to hurt me or neglect me or something like that. And so they have this push-pull strategy in relationship. I want to get close to you, but I also want to move away from you. So in romantic relationships as an adult, the wolf or the sheep ends up displaying both kind of the hailstorm and the turtle characteristics. They can get worked up and angry, and then suddenly like they want to be close, and they can be needy and clingy and want to be close with you. And then suddenly they'll shut down and retreat, but to the extreme. And they have the hardest time out of any of the attachment styles having a healthy, securely attached relationship because they've been through so much trauma. Their brain is so hypervigilant for danger that it perceives danger often when there isn't any danger necessarily. And so they go straight into their reactive survival strategies when sometimes it's not appropriate. And so the wolf learned, especially if they were like, so imagine a child's growing up in an abusive household with an alcoholic parent, and the wolf learns, I can fight back, or I can do something to reduce the abuse. I somehow have some agency here. So maybe if they've got an alcoholic parent who comes in every night and beats them whenever they see the room in a mess, the young child learns to tidy the room and becomes hyper vigilant about making sure nothing is ever out of place. Because if dad walks in drunk and can't see anything out of place, maybe they won't get beaten up. So the wolf becomes controlling. They learn to control their environment as a way to survive. And this is the core trait that the wolf displays, and a need to control their environment. They're not trying to control other people, but they're trying to stop other people messing up their controlled environment. Because when their environment is under their control, they feel safe. Everything's okay. So my wife's a wolf. And the way this shows up in our marriage is she has what I perceive as overly large need to keep everything clean and tidy and in order. Like the kitchen, the dishes always need to be washed. Can't be any water in the sink. She's a chef too, so the kitchen is kind of her domain. But if I go in there and mess up her neatly laid plans, I get into big trouble. The wolf will attack first and ask questions later. And what they're most looking for is safety. They want to feel safe because they grew up in an environment where they didn't. The sheep, on the other hand, is the counterpart to the wolf. They were often less able to control the abuse that was happening to them. And so they had to survive it. So you imagine you've got an alcoholic father and a young girl who's being sexually abused by an alcoholic father. What's the young girl going to be able to do during the sexual abuse? Nothing. There's a big man pinning her down. So the brain checks her out of her body in order to survive this massively traumatic experience. And so she disassociates in order to not be there while this horrible trauma is happening to her. And this becomes her strategy of dealing with difficult experiences as she grows up into an adult. She checks out automatically. And so when conflict arises in her romantic relationships, it's very hard for the sheep to be able to stay present long enough to actually resolve it, because they check out or they submit. They learn to just submit to appease their abuser. And so they just go, whatever you want, honey. And so they often stay in abusive situations longer than they should, not because they don't have the self-esteem, but because this is their survival strategy and it just kicks in unconsciously. And when the abusive situation happens in their marriage, they're often not really there to experience it. They're checked out. Their brain is checked out. And the next morning they wake up and they go, yeah, last night was rough. I remember it, but feel fine now. And they continue on and stay in their marriage rather than leave. And this is how the battered housewife stays being battered, because she wakes up the next morning and she doesn't really remember the emotional impact. She might remember what happened, but she doesn't remember the emotional impact of what happened because she wasn't there when it happened. She was checked out at some level psychologically. And so wolves and sheep often come together like hailstorms and turtles come together. And they have the hardest time in relationships. And what they really need to begin the process of healing is trauma-informed therapy. So those are the attachment styles. This made so much sense to me because suddenly I could see I'm a hailstorm. Why I want to chase my partner, I'm trying to stop them abandoning me, because at some level I perceive that I'm going to be abandoned by my partner. I need to keep them close. And instead of just saying, hey, honey, will you give me a hug and tell me you love me and that everything's okay? I go and I indirectly attempt to get my needs met by acting out. And that's how hailstorms learned how to do it, to make a noise, they're the baby who is inconsolable, wailing at the top of its lungs to try to get mom's attention. And so that's what adults, hailstorms do in a slightly more refined way. And my whole life, I'd attracted turtles who would shut down and leave me feeling abandoned. And so this pattern would go round and round and become a self-fulfilling prophecy that everybody does abandon me. And so when I learned this for the first time, I was like, I'm normal. I'm not broken. And there's something I can do in my relationship to begin building a securely attached relationship. And this is what I help couples do. I help them build securely attached relationships, even if they are individually insecurely attached. Because very often, I'm probably going to be a hailstorm for the rest of my life. I'm always going to be slightly more prone to perceiving abandonment than a securely attached person might. But as an adult who's self-aware, I don't need to act on that impulse anymore. And my wife and I can come together and build a functioning relationship, what Dr. Stan Tatkin calls a secure functioning relationship, even if individually we may be more prone to healing our, prone to being hailstorms or turtles or chameleon or wolf or sheep. Another thing that I found massively interesting while I was learning about attachment styles is that they're not really the kind of thing you can heal in individual therapy because our attachment style was formed in relationship with an attachment figure, meaning our parents. It's healed in relationship with another attachment figure. And as adults, that's our partner, somebody we count on to have our back, to protect us, and to bond with in order to survive. That's what an attachment figure is. So usually in life, we have, parents as attachment figures, maybe best friends, maybe siblings, and our spouses. And so the best way to heal your personal attachment style is to build a securely attached relationship and to work with your partner and to help each other heal. And as I begin to meet my wife's needs, emotional needs that went unmet by her parents as a child, she begins to heal. And if she begins to meet my unmet needs, the needs that, the need for security, for predictability, for consistency, and for comfort, I begin to heal. And then our relationship, the third entity, becomes secure, even if both of us aren't fully securely attached as individuals. And that's what I help couples do at Love at First Sight.
I'm struck by the necessary variety in the different attachment styles. I agree. I think the issue with that and personality types is it tries to generically fit people in. And I think yours categorizes enough. You obviously need distinguishing factors for each one, but you bring in a lot of different components to help speak to it. And I was struck, yeah, I'm certainly the wolf. I lost my father when I was 11, trauma of abandonment, and I find that I resonate with that type. Question: so if someone is a wolf or a sheep and they find that deep healing within themselves, do you find that they could move into one of the other animal types, or do you find that they just live out a more redemptive or whole version of the one that they were before they were healed?
Either or. Generally, when you begin healing, you become more secure. You tend to be able to pause between being triggered and reacting to your trigger. You start reaching out for another for support first instead of attacking or retreating, which is what wolves and sheep tend to do. Wolves will tend to attack first, sheep will tend to retreat first. And as you learn that there's other ways that get you better results than attacking or retreating, that you can actually ask for support and have your needs met, you can open up and be vulnerable and you won't be hurt. So that becomes the more obvious choice. You may always have the tendency to want to control your environment in order to feel safe, but you'll become far more comfortable with your environment being outside of your control, with mess, for example, or with people who come in and, can't be controlled. You're able to just let life be a lot more because you feel fundamentally more safe. Now, you asked about, can you change into another attachment style? The only time I see that really happening is if you change relationship and you're with somebody else who forces you into a different response. So, for example, if you got into a relationship with another wolf, which would be probably very unlikely, but somebody who is kind of more wolfy than you might become the chameleon to try and please them. So it can be relationship dependent. So we have a core attachment style. And if that strategy, because that's what these attachment styles are, they're survival strategies. If that strategy doesn't work for us, like if you're a wolf with another wolf and you're both butting heads, that might result in death, then you're probably going to try a different strategy naturally. It's just our body's way of surviving.
Yeah, that's helpful to hear that, and it's good for people to name how important or hopefully unimportant having trauma or not having trauma impacts your ability to interact. And again, it sounds like most of these attachment styles that you named are more objective than they are subjective. The way we interpret them is subjective, but more
Yes.
so our ability within our relationships to try to understand each other in that you can see that this person isn't trying to do this most of the time or out to get me based on this characteristic there. It's actually, this is just, I need to remember their archetype, their attachment style, and know where they're coming from. And I find that's a key component to why most people in their relationships, and this is a last point I'd really like to get your perspective on, is this notion that most relationships can and were made to work. And it's really a falsity that the majority of relationships are meant to fail and not work out. So I'm curious, what is the biggest lie most couples often have, that they believe in feeling like the relationship's a failure that they need to get to give up? And what would you say is a healthier belief to reinstill the value for working it out, staying together, making it happen? Assuming there's not fundamental differences, like we're not talking about an objective disconnect to the point where you just know it's not meant to work. I'm talking about more the subjective.
The biggest lie I think that trips couples up is that conflict shouldn't happen if you're in a good relationship. And I think the mindset that's empowering is that conflict is a normal part of relationship, and you need to work through it. Now, when it comes to, I don't believe all relationships are meant to last. If I look at my own life, thank goodness my previous relationships hadn't lasted, because each one taught both me and my partner at the time lessons that prepared me for the relationship that I'm in now, for my marriage. And I would hate to be with one of the girls I was dating when I was 17 years old. We were young and immature, and we would have blown each other up. It wasn't appropriate for that to last, in order for me to learn what I needed to learn for my life to turn out the way that it is, which I am just thrilled about the way that it's turned out. And I think where couples get stuck is with their requirements. So the only relationships that don't really, that I think shouldn't continue, are ones where your requirements aren't met. So I make this distinction called needs versus requirements. So our needs are things that we can count on our partner to meet with us, our relational needs, like the need for comfort, the need for support, the need for sex, the need for their needs we can't, their relational needs we cannot meet by ourselves. We're totally dependent on our partner to meet them with us, and it's totally appropriate. We also have individual needs that we should be meeting for ourselves, like our need for fulfillment in life and for a career that makes us happy, and the need to be able to put a roof over our head, and those are all personal needs. And there are multiple ways that your needs can get met in relationships. So if your need for feeling heard isn't being met by your partner, you can go and have a conversation with them, and you guys can figure it out together. And that need can eventually be met with learning how to listen better. There are other needs that they're so black and white. It's either met or it's unmet. And I call these requirements. And if your requirements are unmet, you will never be happy in a relationship. Most of us can count our requirements on one hand. The dangerous distinction, and I want to warn people watching this, is like not to confuse your requirements with needs. Many people think, like, I have a need for no yelling. I mean, I have a requirement for no yelling. That's not a requirement. That's a need. You can live with yelling. You're not going to die if yelling happens in your relationship. You're going to be fine. But for some people, for example, some women have a requirement of having a baby. That's their life dream. They want a baby, and they're not willing to entertain a relationship with a partner who doesn't want a child. If that's the case, don't get into a relationship if your partner doesn't want a child. Other requirements that are simple is like, some people are very clear. They know themselves well enough to know that they only want to live by the ocean in nature. And other people are very clear they only want to live in the city. This was my first wife and I. Like, I grew up on the ocean, and my dream was to live on an island in the Caribbean, where I now live in the Dominican Republic on the beach. And her dream, that was a nightmare for her. We actually went to the Turks and Caicos on vacation once. I said, babe, what do you think about moving here? She says, oh my God, like, are you crazy? That sounds like hell to me. She's a city girl. She wants to be in the city, in the concrete jungle, surrounded by the busyness. And eventually, like, that was one of the biggest things. We were living in London. I hated London. I just couldn't stand the gray and the city and the concrete, and there was no nature. I wanted to be in nature. And eventually, that was one of the big factors that led to us being divorced amicably because we both realized like we are not, we want completely different things out of life. What we want out of a relationship and out of life is not compatible. And so we lovingly divorced, and we're still friends now. We still talk. And she's found another man and married, and I found my wife and married her, and we're both very happy in our relationships right now. That's when your requirements aren't met, and it's much, much rarer. Most couples come to me with needs not being met. They're fighting all the time. They're fighting over their needs not being met. So that's the only time I would really say to a couple, you guys might want to consider, that this relationship is never going to meet your requirements without both of you feeling like you're compromising something massive. But it's rare. And usually we have two or three requirements. That's it. Like children, you know, or monogamy is often a requirement. Like when one partner wants an open relationship and the other one doesn't, really not going to work. You should probably just go your separate ways and go do what you want to do and be happy. You know?
Yeah, that's so helpful. I couldn't agree more. And I just think about previous generations overemphasizing commitment and fidelity and loyalty to the relationship just for the sake of relationship. Call that hyper traditionalism. Unfortunately, we've got so allergic to that. We've found the opposite where, so many of us are non-committal in so many different ways because it is so accessible and easy just to give up on something and quit. You're not going to experience shame because you can usually do it in isolation. It's not like y'all live in the same town and someone's going to see you again. You have this, I think, false sense of freedom to just choose what you want and just to say, well, it's not working, leaving, and you don't put the onus on what you can do. But it sounds like this framework you're offering with the needs and requirements offers an objective reflection to see how valid it is that you should or shouldn't leave. Basically, know your requirements. If you know that those requirements cannot be met in the relationship or they're shared with that person in order to live them out, there you go. You have the sign. If not, then you need to move to saying, I'm staying, but then what are the needs I need to focus on expressing and to re-highlight the requirements in order to make sure we're not letting anything slip through the cracks. Where can people find your work and what you're up to?
Loveatfirstfight with an F.com. Loveatfirstfight.com. And there's a free course there that I offer for couples. It's called, or individuals. I mean, you can go through it solo too. It's called Love Unlocked. It's a 5-day video program where I teach you the basic skills and ideas behind having a securely attached relationship. Go check it out. It's awesome. I also have paid courses. We specialize in helping couples through conflict and helping them get back on the same page and be happy together. And you can go check those out too if you like. And there's tons of free info on my website. Just head over to loveatfirstfight.com and you can download that straight away.
All right, guys. So whether or not you're looking for a relationship, you want to better your relationship, you want to figure out if you should stay in one, all of the above, please go check out Bruce's work. We'll put all that in the show notes. Bruce, thank you again for your time, brother. And guys, until next time.
Absolute pleasure, Wes. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye, everybody.